Wow, we see a lot of friends here. Who here has walked in sub-freezing temperatures with the New Hampshire Rebellion on a day kind of like today? God bless you all. Has anybody here walked way back when with the founder of Open Democracy, Granny D? Yes. Wow. And round of applause for all of you. Wonderful. And it goes without saying, but those who have volunteered with Open Democracy and NH Rebellion, I see a lot of you here too. Well, thank you. Anybody here who's brand new to Open Democracy and New Hampshire Rebellion? A couple of well, welcome. Thank you so much. We're honored that you've come out to this beautiful Lawrence Barn in Hollis, true New Hampshire style. We're particularly honored to have a number of our elected representatives and talk about public service. They make $100 a year, and a number of them even donated to be here. Thank you so much. But we have with us Representative Rennie Cushing, lead sponsor of the reform legislation we'll be talking about shortly. My representative from just up the street, Cindy Rosenwald, Deputy Democratic Leader. Thank you, Cindy. We have also from the Seacoast, Mindy Messner. Thank you, Mindy, for being here. And an announced candidate for Congress in CD1. Thank you. We have also Representative Jim McConnell. Thank you so much for being here. And this is, it hopefully goes without saying, but we are a nonpartisan, cross-partisan organization. And we're honored to have representatives from both parties and citizens who identify as liberal and conservative or somewhere in between here tonight. I want to say a special thanks to a number of people who made tonight possible. Most of all, the irreplaceable Doreen Demarais. Doreen, are you around? She's somewhere, probably in the kitchen, tuning up. But thank you to Doreen, who's been with us for years, who's been making all of these events possible. We had a number of volunteers come out early this afternoon to help prepare. Peter Martell for once again providing the sound as you've done over the years. Thank you so much, Peter. And the many people who donated items to the auction. Did we mention there's an auction behind us? If you haven't been yet, we will keep it open until the end of the night. So we do encourage you to check it out. And some special items in particular, a little bit pricier, but if anybody enjoys a nice summer weekend on Squam Lake or on days like this, a winter getaway to Florida, we have some vacations donated as well as beautiful items for the season. I want to also ask if my fellow board members from Open Democracy would just stand, members of the Open Democracy Board. Thank you so much. Many of these individuals have been with this cause since Granny D got us going nearly a decade ago, and thank you for your commitment all of these years. Without further ado, I want to hand the mic over to the person who keeps the wheels turning day in and day out, and I do mean day in and day out. It's really a 7-day-a-week job. Sorry, Olivia, that we worked so hard. But Open Democracy and New Hampshire Rebellion would not exist, would not be happening without the incredible hard work, the energy, the smarts, the willingness to take on this challenge of our executive director. So let me turn it over to Olivia Zink.
It really is truly my honor and privilege to do this work and get to work for democracy every day. I want to thank you all for being here tonight, and more importantly, how was the meal? Yay! So now that we did the dinner part of our evening, we'll switch to the democracy part of our evening. And some of you know that I'm a mother, and my 8-year-old daughter says to many people, "What does your mom do for a living?" And she says, "My mom works for democracy." And her teacher even questioned, "Really? Does she do that?" And in that moment, she's in 3rd grade, and one of her classmates has really gotten really interested, curious. What is democracy? What is this all about? And she keeps talking to my daughter about this. And I just want all of you to know how much joy it is to watch my work and life spill over, and that my daughter shares this with her classmates. And I encourage you to invite your friends and family into the cause, because our people's movement will not happen without all of us inviting more people that we love and care about into this movement for change. And when we talk about wanting to reform the system, in the middle of your program book, it's sort of our year in review. But we've done a lot of things this year, from walking to 15 Granny D performances where we inspire other folks. But the thing that I'm most proud of is when we're talking to new activists, groups of people in libraries or church basements who are new to the cause, who want to know how they can make a difference. People really want to participate in our government and participate in our reform movement. And so some of my best memories of this year are when we're meeting new folks, or the phone rings and someone says, I want to get involved. And that's what brings me joy every day, to welcome those people into our movement for change. And I'm going to invite Dan back up because we have a couple of special awards tonight.
Thank you, Olivia. For those who don't know, this movement wouldn't happen without amazing volunteers. And we have them at every level and every aspect of the work that we do, from folks planning and hosting an event like this to those who are setting the strategic direction and by serving on the board and on the advisory board. And we have, for the last handful of years, been pleased to give out Granny D Awards, inspired by, of course, Doris Haddock from Dublin, New Hampshire, who walked the walk as much as a human being possibly can when she crossed this country on foot for campaign finance reform. And we have on the top of these awards a brief quote from Granny D's, which you might have seen before, which says simply, democracy is not something we have, it's something we do. Democracy is a verb. It requires our ongoing participation. It's not just handed on down from above. It requires our ongoing action. And so we wanted to honor two individuals with Granny D Awards tonight for 2017 who have been with this cause since the very beginning, providing leadership since the beginning, by playing that critical role of chairing the Open Democracy Board until earlier this year. The first individual goes back to this work long before Open Democracy even existed, as a member of the famous Tuesday Morning Academy. Granny D and other women in the Monadnock area who would gather in living rooms on Tuesday mornings and study the issues of the day. And it was in that academy that the crazy idea of Granny D's walk and the activism that preceded it was born. And Regina Bringhoff, from those early days in the 90s to the founding of Open Democracy, serving as co-chair from the beginning in 2009, all the way to earlier this year in 2017, has been a tireless crusader for this work. And so we are very pleased to honor Regina as our first recipient. And just before I ask her to come up, let me also say a word about her co-chair and the second recipient. Gordon Allen, the other co-chair of the Open Democracy Board since 2009, was someone I got to know back in the 90s when I was a student at Conval High School. At that time, he was serving as a state legislator. He was one of the driving forces behind the first generation of campaign finance reform, citizen-funded elections legislation that was introduced in the late 90s, that was proceeding through the House and Senate in the early 2000s. As a high school student, I had the chance to work with him, then as chair when Gordon chaired New Hampshire Citizens Alliance, part of his decades-long commitment to this work, not just on democratic reform, but a host of important policy changes. And when Granny D and others came together to form the Coalition for Open Democracy, Gordon was really the driving force as that first co-chair of our board. And throughout the years, from the unglamorous stuff in the background, completing the tax forms at the end of the year and writing the strategic plans, to active organizing and bringing in leaders like Rick Smith and other national figures to be part of this movement. Gordon Allen has been a critical driving force behind our work. So would you join me, please, in honoring Regina Bringolf and Gordon Allen with the 2017 Granny D Awards, and would you both please come up?
But it sounds good. Thank you. It's been, this is work you cannot not do. And we've got to keep at it. Here.
Absolutely, Gordon. And I'm just heartened by, first of all, the attendance here at this occasion, and then the fact that there is new blood, there are new board members who come and contribute their energy to our cause, which we'll have to continue fighting for, and thank you all for participating in that.
Thank you, Gordon, who always brought humor in tough situations, and always, when there was tough things happening, Regina would always sneak out some chocolate and put it in the middle of the table. So they both brought so much of their time and talent to the cause. And without further ado, we're going to introduce our keynote speaker.
Well, for the main event now, it was at this dinner 4 years ago, which we titled that time Lasagna and Lessig, only to find out some of us didn't know that you didn't go for the meat lasagna. Respect. This night, 4 years ago, we welcomed Professor Lawrence Lessig from Harvard to come and give keynote remarks at our annual fall dinner. And as I think nobody, except of course the professor himself, was expecting, what began that night was the seed of the New Hampshire Rebellion, when Larry proposed this idea that citizens might just be crazy enough a few months hence in January to head on up to Dixville Notch together at the tippy top of New Hampshire, near Canada, and begin walking nearly 200 miles south all the way across the state to declare a citizens' rebellion against the corrupting influence of money in politics. It was a brand new idea 4 years ago, birthed, I don't know quite how it all came about, perhaps you'll tell us, Larry, but brought to us by Professor Lawrence Lessig. And in the months that followed, we rallied together, and this New Hampshire Rebellion was born. It became part of open democracy. As we saw a few minutes ago, many of you since then, whether you took part in that first march from Dixville Notch to Nashua, the brave 30 or so people who made it the whole way, and hundreds more who participated along the way, or a year later, if you joined us as we marched from the four corners of the state, Dixville Notch again, Nashua, Keene, and Portsmouth, congregating on Concord many days later, or in the subsequent marches we've done all over the state, a collective 40,000 miles. Something very significant was born. Now we're counting on Larry not declaring something quite that crazy tonight. Of course, we should expect big ideas. We aren't exactly geared up for a march in January, unless there's some real diehards in the hall, because we have some other big plans to announce for January, which we'll get to after Professor Lessig's remarks. But what we'll hear tonight, and I think part of the gift that Larry brings as a national leader in the reform movement, who's been a leading voice these last 4 years and for many years before that in promoting the need for comprehensive campaign finance reform and a whole slate of democracy reforms. Professor Lessig will bring more of that national perspective. We are a movement of movements, which unites people with diverse political views and issue interests around this central challenge of money in politics and the need for true democracy. And so we're excited that Professor Lessig has been leading the fight for another aspect of the democracy reforms that we believe are necessary around the Electoral College. And if you might have seen an op-ed just this morning in The Hill and other writings that he's been doing. So we're going to learn about this national movement, and then we're going to bring it back to New Hampshire at the end. So without further ado, Professor Lessig.
It's so wonderful to be back, and Dan was so good at filibustering while the technology tried to come alive, and we're still not there. So I'm not going to be as good as Dan is in filibustering while the technology is not coming alive. We had this done before, and unfortunately we made the critical mistake of disconnecting.
Did anybody mention there's an auction behind me?
Yeah. Recognized until Dan said this, that it was 4 years ago at this dinner that we proposed the New Hampshire Rebellion. I remembered it was a dinner with many of you, but I didn't remember the name of the dinner, so here it is. It's the 4th anniversary. And I feel like I come to New Hampshire to report my thinking, my evolution of thinking. And that's what I want to do tonight. I want to talk to you about an issue we've been talking about for at least 4 years, but in a little different way, as a way to point to what I hope is hope about finally solving this problem that we all have been fighting for so long to solve. So Dan mentioned this article I wrote for The Hill this morning, and I want to begin by talking about the argument of that article. And the point that I made in that article is that the United States is in a bipolar position. On the one hand, we have never since the Civil War been more divided. But on the other hand, we have never, maybe in our history, been as united. We are divided by political party, Republicans divided by Democrats. We now live in tribes. And these tribes practice a kind of politics of hate. We Democrats roll our eyes at what's going on in Alabama as people find it difficult to decide whether to vote for a pedophile or a Democrat. But before we get too self-righteous, we should remember what was going on 20 years ago, when many Republicans were wondering how could we possibly be as forgiving as we were of our President Clinton. Tribes. That's who we are. And this membership in tribes is increasingly enforced, and it's enforced in the social media infrastructure that we have built in our lives. Our lives on Facebook and in Twitter are in constant terror of saying something that might signal incorrectly our own political allegiance and then be called out or defriended, unfriended, because we happen to have said something more tolerant of the other side than we should have been. Our job, constantly, is to affirm our loyalty by denouncing them. The politics of hate is wired into our emotions. We are divided. But then we are united. And we are united by a belief that's framed sometimes as dissatisfaction, the dissatisfaction with government. There was an extraordinary study, not reported enough on, conducted in July of 2016, of attitudes of Americans at the University of Maryland, a huge study of some 2,200 American voters. And what they found was that dissatisfaction with our government is as high as it has ever been in the history of polling. But more importantly, the reasons that we are dissatisfied are reasons that we are united upon. We all believe government does not represent us. And we believe it does not represent us in terms that are familiar to open democracy and the New Hampshire Rebellion. So in this study, Congress does not serve the common good of the people. 85% agree with that idea, but look at the difference between Democrats and Republicans. There is no difference. Corporations and their lobbyists have too much influence. 89% agree with that. There is no difference between Republicans and Democrats. Elected officials think more about the interests of their campaign donors than the common good of the people. 89%, 92% of Republicans, 88% of Democrats. Big campaign donors have too much influence. 91% of all voters, 90% of Republicans, 91% of Democrats. We are united in the view that we have a representative democracy that does not represent us. And so you might look at that union and you might say, is that a reason for hope? And my fear is that the answer is nope. And it's not a reason for hope yet because of how we do politics in America. Politics is done living in divided land, oblivious to united land. This is how I mean that. We have two dominant parties, Republicans and Democrats, and we have two elections, a primary and a general election. Most of us vote in the general election. Some of us vote in the primary. We who vote in the primary are the most partisan, the most extreme. And so candidates know that to win the primary, they have to appeal to the most extreme. And so when they win, the people who win are the best pick to be the most hated by the other side. We have a machine for reinforcing the politics of hate. That's the primary system we've produced. And that machine means when the general election comes along, there's no one who is able to leverage the part that we are united about. The union bit of American politics. Now this is a huge problem. It's a problem for democracy because this anger and cynicism and frustration destroys trust in our government. It destroys trust in government, and that hurts everyone, but it especially hurts Democrats. Because, of course, Democrats want to convince people there is something government can do to solve problems that we believe the nation faces. But as cynicism and skepticism about government grows, no one has patience for anyone suggesting there's a role for government. Ronald Reagan, in his inaugural address, 1981, famously said, "Government is not the solution. Government is the problem." And the truth is, this we all believe today, not because we are libertarians in the way that Ronald Reagan meant that statement, but because most of us believe the government is just corrupted, unrepresentative. And though we might think there's a solution that government in theory might offer, in practice, we don't think there's any role for government because in practice we don't believe government represents us. This we have to repair. This we have to find a way to repair. We have to find a way to rise above this partisan division. We have to find a way to speak to the union that exists beyond this partisan division. Now, I think this is possible. And not many people agree with me, but I think it is possible to find this common ground and to speak and rally people to this common ground. Not necessarily politicians first, though it's wonderful to see the mix of politicians here who we have rallied to this common ground. But at least people first. And to get to this common ground, though, I think we have to go back and ask, what is it we could agree about? And the core idea I think we can agree on is an idea that motivated our representative democracy, the idea of democracy. Now, that idea was not very complicated in the framing of our Constitution. The framers thought about this in a very mechanical way. They thought, how do we produce a system that would guarantee that the representatives steered themselves towards the interests of the people. And as I've quoted in events with many of you here before, the core idea that Madison had for framing that mechanism was to produce a Congress that would have the obligation to be, quote, dependent on the people alone. And then in Federalist 57, he made clear we understood what he meant by the people when he explained not the rich more than the poor. Dependent on the people alone, not the rich more than the poor. Now that idea is an expression of equality, and it's not surprising that we have that expression in our Constitution, because the Declaration, which started the movement that led to that Constitution, said, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men, okay, all white men, but men certainly, but all men are created equal. Equality was the core idea that animated the representative democracy that they gave us. Not the rich more than the poor followed from that idea of equality, and dependent on the people alone is the expression of that equality. But we have to recognize the Constitution that they gave us is not consistent about this value. This principle is compromised in the Constitution. It was compromised, of course, by slavery, but it was compromised institutionally by the Senate of the United States. This is an institution that drove Madison nuts. He hated the idea that his beautiful design would be stained by this unequal institution. But this was where theory met practice. And what he understood was that the ideals of equality had to be compromised because it was necessary if we were going to have a union. Now one might ask, if we hadn't had a union, would slavery have ended sooner? You know, it's not clear it was the best all around. But we can't admit that idea. We have to accept the idea that this union, this Constitution, was constructed with a core principle of equality and an exception. And the exception was expressed in the Senate. Now, as I look at this, what I fear is that we've allowed this exception of inequality to become the rule in too many parts of our constitutional design. This inequality has grown. This principle of inequality has spread in our Constitution. And the challenge that we have is to recognize now just how broadly it has spread. So, for example, we would think that in a representative democracy, everyone would have an equal freedom to vote. But as Charles Stewart at MIT calculated in the election of 2016, techniques to suppress the votes of some, whether that's techniques to force IDs or techniques to remove people from the voting booth or just inequality in the access to technology to vote, meant that some 16 million votes were suppressed in that election. 16 million voters thus didn't have equal representation in that election. Or think about the way we select the president. Of course, it's the Electoral College that selects the president. That's in the Constitution. But states, all but 2 states, have a system of winner-take-all for deciding how the electors in that state will be allocated. So though 1 million people voted for Donald Trump in Massachusetts, not a single Electoral College vote went to Donald Trump. Now what that means is that people who happen to be in the minority in their state vote just to have their vote thrown away. And if you happen to be a Republican in Massachusetts or a Democrat in Texas, what you know is your vote for president does not matter. And if you happen to be a Republican in California, you think my views as a Republican in California don't matter to the Republican Party because my votes will not matter. And so here again, the idea of equality is betrayed, because these votes don't count equally. And what that means is, in this last election, 52 million people voted to have their votes thrown away. Or think about the House of Representatives, system of gerrymandering that we have allowed to evolve inside our constitutional republic. What gerrymandering is for the House is the design of districts so that the vast majority, 90%, are safe seat districts. And what it means to be a safe seat district is, if you are the minority in that district, a Republican in a Democratic safe seat district or a Democrat in a Republican safe seat district, your vote can never matter to that representative, because you will never flip from one party to another in that district. And so all but about 45 districts in the 435 House seats are safe seat districts, which means that the minority votes in those districts are not equal to the votes of others in districts where they have equal representation, which in the last election is 89 million votes, just rendered unequal because of this system. Or the House, the Senate, of course, because of 2 senators per state, the thing that drove Madison nuts. Madison got upset because Delaware would get 1 vote, while Virginia would have to have 13 votes to be the equivalent. And he said, the idea that 13 to 1 expresses representative democracy is anathema. It's not what equality is. But today those numbers have exploded. So today, Wyoming gets 1 vote, and you have to have 66 votes in California to be equal to the 1 vote in Wyoming. Which means in the Senate, there are 114 million Americans whose votes are worth less than the rest of the voters in voting for the Senate. And then there's the issue that has united us since Grandy D started this movement. The inequality as funders. We know we have a system of private funding of public elections, which means that in Congress, members of Congress spend anywhere between 30 and 70% of their time raising money, dialing for dollars. I mean, you guys are all familiar with this technology. When I tell my students about this, they're wondering what that is, but that's a telephone for your kids out here. Dialing for dollars, calling no more than 100,000 Americans. That's even optimistic as the number that are really relevant here. 100,000 Americans. So we are unequal as funders to 139 million, 139.9 million voters, irrelevant here too. And that means that, you can't even, that's not even proportion. You have to take 1 man and divide him into a fifth. So 1/5 of 1 man from that chart has power and the rest does not, because of the way we fund elections. Add this all up. And the conclusion is pretty obvious here, right? We are not equal as citizens in America. We are not equal as citizens. The core promise of a representative democracy, equality, is denied in the system that we have allowed to evolve. And what that means is that they cannot represent us because they are so busy representing them. We can't get what we want. We won't get what we want unless they happen to want it too. So this exception, this inequality at the core of our Constitution is now the rule. And this inequality has become a norm accepted across the political system. And it's this inequality we must fight, to fight for this principle of equality again. It's not the first fight for equality in the history of the American Republic. I think the most inspirational and tragic fight for equality in American history, of course, is the 400-year fight that African Americans have had to wage for equality in America. First for their freedom, then for their civil and political and social rights in America. And this fight for equality that they underwent inspiring and tragic in the way it had to express itself, had a certain advantage for them that we don't have. And the advantage is this. In the history of that 400-year fight, no one ever doubted that the system was unequal for them. There was no African American who was confused about whether America treated everybody equally on the basis of race. They got it. And they fought, and then other people fought with them, and finally there has been progress, not yet fully, but finally progress. But we don't have that advantage, because for this inequality of citizenship, is like the carbon monoxide of a republic. It's invisible and odorless and tasteless. We don't even notice it. Especially we white men don't notice it, because we go through life kind of thinking we're at the top, and we don't have an experience of recognizing the way the system tilts against us. And what that means is that we have to find a way to force people to recognize that this basic promise has been denied us too. This equality. It's a kind of identity politics for citizenship. It's a recognition that the core promise has been denied to us, and we have to find a way to motivate a fight to get that equality back. Now, for more than a decade, I've done everything I can to find a way to fight for this democracy. And every sane idea and every insane idea I could muster, some more insane than others. I'm happy to celebrate one of the most insane here, as we 4 years ago mapped this out and began an incredible walk across this state to remind the world of the woman who walked across the country with the same insane idea that we could find a way to restore a principle of equality in our democracy again. And maybe that's not even the craziest idea that I've had, but we won't talk about that other really crazy idea that I had. But it was here, in these walks across New Hampshire, that I felt first, most profoundly, what that poll from the University of Maryland teaches. That there is no American, certainly no New Hampshirean that I met who ever doubted that the system we have right now was not representing them. We had a joke on our first walk. We had done a poll and we had found 96% of Americans believe it important to reduce the influence of money in politics. So for our whole walk, we kept on saying to people, we're looking for the 4%. Are you one of the 4% who doesn't believe that it's important to reduce the influence of money in politics? And I thought one time we were going to be punched because someone was so insulted that we would have thought that he didn't believe it was important to reduce the influence of money in politics. We were united and we could feel it here. Republicans and Democrats and undeclareds alike believe fundamentally in this point that we have been fighting for. And indeed in this last election, if you think about the undeclareds in that election, 38% of this state. In the votes leading up to the primary in 2016, the toughest choice voters had was between Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. And I remember when that was reported, I was on a television show and I was talking to another political analyst, and he said, I think they're just confused. Because how could you have a hard choice between Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump? And the fact, of course, is that New Hampshireans were not confused. It's the partisans who were confused. Because what New Hampshire people saw was that both of these candidates were promising a way to address this fundamental corruption of our system. They talked about it in different ways, and of course, we, depending on our partisan views, believe them in different ways, but they both were challenging this fundamental corruption. And what they were confused about, these analysts, was the power and frustration that's at the core of our democracy and the thing we need to do something to address. So I am proud, so proud to see how this movement has developed. But I think what we need to do is to grow this recognition, grow this ability to rise above the partisan division. Not just here, but across the country. And I still think that here, it must happen first. In this state, there's the greatest opportunity to articulate the idea that you are not just Republicans or Democrats, that as undeclareds all, you can say there's a value that is more than either of these parties alone, and that value is to restore, to recover, to get back this democracy that we know we have lost. In these 10 years, I think there are 3 ideas I think organize how we should think about fighting for this democracy. The first is we fight as citizens. Not as Democrats and not as Republicans, but as citizens first. It's hard for politicians to frame it like that, but it should be natural for us to frame it like that. We were citizens before we were Democrats, and we were citizens before we were Republicans. And it's as citizens that we have to fight to get this democracy back. That's number 2. That's number 1. Number 2, we have to raise this as a moral idea that's about fighting for something more than just us. In fact, it's a fight not primarily for us. Because if you think of who loses most because we have a system that cannot govern itself, the people who lose most are our children. Because think of every problem that we would identify as a problem that we can't solve, at least at the federal level. Climate change. Who will bear the burden of climate change? Those of us over 50 will be long gone when the real consequences of climate change express themselves. But not our children. They will be here and they will feel those consequences because they are the ones who will be impacted most. Or think about the debt, which is our literally borrowing from our children. Borrowing that we will never repay. Because we can't govern ourselves. Fiscally responsible, we cannot govern ourselves. It is the children who bear the burden of that, or a healthcare system that delivers the poorest efficiency of healthcare of any comparable system around the world. Who bears the burden? Not people like us who are in systems that are relatively stable. It is our children who can't afford to buy even into Obamacare today. Or the economy, which seems circa 1977 to have stalled. And wealth continues in one space, but no wealth in another place. No growth, no opportunity for whom? For these children. In each of these places, we have to recognize that the problems that motivate us, the problems that get us out to try to change the way government works, are problems we will never solve until we solve this core corruption, and we have to solve this corruption for them, for the love for them first. And then finally, we have to fight for a certain kind of respect. Self-respect. I am so inspired to think of the struggle African Americans went through to fight for their equality, because dignity, the self-respect they had, led them to fight. Or women. The dignity of that battle for equality, for finally the right to participate equally as citizens, that was an expression of dignity, their own self-respect. So where is the self-respect for the rest of us? Where is this recognition that there's a dignity that's been taken from us when we live in a system that so plainly and completely denies us an equality of citizenship? Why don't we feel the same outrage that would force us to organize to demand this simple core promise of a representative democracy? We need leaders to rise above the partisan division, to remind us we are citizens first. We need leaders to remind us of what we have inherited, a democracy we could be proud of, and what we are passing to our children, a democracy that no one is proud of. We need leaders who could ignite within us the courage to fight for that democracy again. And those leaders are you, each of you. You need to ask yourself, are you a citizen or are you a Republican? Party first or country first? Are you a citizen or are you a Democrat? Party first or country first? Do you have the love for your children and your country that would lead you to sacrifice to make this democracy alive again? And can you recover the dignity that drives soldiers to risk their lives in the name, not of a party, but in the name of democracy? There's no group of people I've ever known that make me more hopeful when I ask those questions than you. My friends, the people I've worked with here for 4 years, but who have inspired the nation for many more years than that. But we have many more miles to walk. Because the ideals you've lived and the practices you've helped give life to have to spread far beyond the state. And I am fearful that if we can't ignite this passion now, that the children who look at us with promise today will look at us with impatient scorn tomorrow. We have failed them, but we can win for them from the ideals that you've shown that Granny D gave us and that we live every day we gather like this. So I'm grateful and thank you. And thank you very much for what you have done.
Thank you so much, Professor Lessig, for continuing to inspire this movement of ours. And if anybody in this room has walked the talk these last 4 years and more, it is you, Larry. Thank you. As we bring the formal program to a close, I want to just share a few words and then invite you to mingle around and get some dessert and check out that auction a final time. I want to ask, what brings you here tonight? I know for me, as some of you know, I'm an old New Hampshire boy, proud to be 12 generations Granite State, but I'm married to a brand new American citizen. My wife Sindiso from South Africa, and our 2 little kids look a little different than both of us, is the truth. And there are many issues that motivate us, and one that particularly motivates me these days, which of course comes back to why I'm here tonight, and why I suspect many of you here are here tonight, is that half of my family now, in the place that my wife and I feel a deep commitment to, the continent of Africa broadly, South Africa in particular, that's the part of the world least responsible for the climate crisis that faces us, but most affected by it. In fact, the Climate Change Vulnerability Index reports that 7 of the 10 countries most at risk for climate change are in Africa. Some 12 million people in East Africa recently experienced the worst food crisis of the 21st century due to climate change. Desertification, drought, crop failures, and on have been affecting many, many countries across the continent, to the point where half the population in large countries like Nigeria is already without access to clean water. UN predicts that in the coming years, the biggest source of conflict in Africa won't be dictators, it will be access to clean water. Our own Pentagon has declared that climate change is the biggest national security threat of the 21st century, as not 65 million refugees today in Syria and other places, the worst refugee situation since World War II, but hundreds of millions and eventually even billions of people become displaced due to this. And when I go back to South Africa, I see the effects. Friends of ours who I've gotten to work with in the past when we lived there who are really scraping to get by when Southern Africa has also been experiencing a couple of years of drought and hundreds of thousands of children have experienced famine, and I could go on. But when you trace issues like the climate crisis, and pick your own, when you trace them back to their source, the question, why are we failing to address issues now some decades after the scientific consensus has arrived at the reason for this issue, it takes us back time and time again to this fundamental corruption, this institutional corruption that Professor Lessig described and that you all know about. Where on an issue like energy policy, for decades, for a century really, the primary influence has been the fossil fuel lobby. $250 million in the last election in campaign donations and lobbying, just 2016. Hundreds of millions in previous elections. So pick your issue, friends. Whatever it may be, if we are failing to address it as we ought, often in ways that folks on both the right and left agree we ought, the chances are it comes back to this failure which emanates from this inequality of citizenship, this basic violation of our promise as a democratic republic. Now, we've heard from Professor Lessig the why, and each of us has our own story. And we've walked through in the last half hour a few of the critical reforms that we will have to enact if we are ever to have any semblance of equal citizenship in this country. Those are big challenges, and you know, we all know they're not going to change overnight. They're national movements that I seek to be a part of, that I hope all of you will become a part of or continue to be a part of. But while that's all a bit of a downer for me, I want to end tonight by pointing to something very specific that we here in New Hampshire have the chance to do that can put us at the forefront of addressing this problem and achieving something closer to equal citizenship here in New Hampshire. And it takes the form of a bill that we've recently introduced, Representative Cushing and others who are here tonight taking the lead, introducing a new idea that hasn't been tried in any state as yet, although a couple of cities have led the way. A variation on the theme of an old reform that we've been talking about for years, that Granny D was talking about in her day. In fact, Teddy Roosevelt was talking about it over a century ago, the idea of citizen-funded elections. But we think a New Hampshire twist that we're excited about, we hope you will get excited about and be part of in the New Hampshire legislature in the coming year. We're calling it civic dollars. Today, in New Hampshire, approximately 590 individuals provide a majority of all the money that funds our campaigns for state office. We're not nearly as bad as Washington, but we still have privately owned public elections where big state lobbies, whether it's the utilities, what have you, on the right and on the left, labor unions and corporations alike, contribute most of the money that funds our campaigns. Only about 1% of us contribute any money at all, and like I said, that roughly 590 individuals provide a majority of it. That's 0.06%, more than half of the money in New Hampshire. That's big money from a few. We can flip that system on its head by going from big money from a few to small money from many, real citizen-owned elections where we own the process that elects our politicians, where we attract the leaders that we need People who might have all the ideas and inspiration and experience and connections that we think would make a good public servant, especially for those more expensive races, the state senate, executive council, and governor, but who may not be millionaires or know a bunch of millionaires to fund their campaigns. The democracy dollars idea would put, if you will, purchasing power in the hands of every eligible voter in the state of New Hampshire, where we would be able to direct the first $100 of our tax money in the form of 4 $25 certificates, civic dollars, to the candidates of our choice running for state office. The candidates who receive these civic dollars would make a very simple bargain. They would say, in exchange for the benefit of civic dollars, where not a couple hundred of my constituents who have a lot of money can potentially fund my campaign, but all of my constituents can potentially fund my campaign, making sure that I have enough resources to run a real campaign. In response for that, in thanks for that benefit, they agreed to a much lower limit on private donations. Not the $7,000 that candidates routinely raise from a single individual today, but $250 for state senate, executive council, $500 for government. They accept those low limits, and they get the benefit of being able to consider their grassroots door-knocking, canvassing, to be one and the same thing with fundraising. No sitting in the cubicles asking, typically out-of-state donors for big money, going to their friends and their neighbors and their community halls and their churches, raising small donations, civic dollars, $25 at a time, and thereby giving us as voters true ownership of this process. It's a new idea. We think it's something that is right for New Hampshire. We think it's the kind of innovation that we should always be looking for. It's not a one-size-fits-all system where every candidate gets the same amount of money. Some deserve to raise more money because they work harder, because they appeal to more people, whether they're left or right. They have the flexibility to raise private donations, but only up to those low limits. And we think this could have a transformative impact. If it's an issue like climate change, no longer would the big utilities, who are typically the ones having that undue influence on energy policy in the state, no longer would they be the only people seated at the table. But candidates who want to solve that challenge or any other challenge, if they can appeal to their friends and neighbors, show that they're serious, say no thanks to the big money, raise those civic dollars, they can become real players in our democracy. There are many reforms that have to happen, but this, we believe, is the single most impactful reform whose time has come. It won't be easy, obviously. It will involve a little bit of money. We estimate not more than $5 million a year. It will involve a lot of citizen lobbying, a lot of calling our legislators, a lot of testifying in Concord, of engaging our friends and neighbors online and offline in the real world. And so we want to close tonight with an ask of all of you. On your table is one of these cards. A couple of very simple ways that you, as a concerned citizen, as a believer in equal citizenship, can be involved. First of all, adding your name as a citizen co-sponsor of this bill, joining the bipartisan legislators who have already added their names, Republicans and Democrats. We want thousands of Granite Staters to sign up as co-sponsors. Then contacting your legislator, organizing friends and support as we go out into communities, as we've done in the past and need to do on a whole new scale if we're going to make this bill law. We want you to write in your local papers those letters to the editor that many of you have written before, but they count. We need that free media, and to write to anybody who will listen. And then finally, you've donated at least $50 tonight, and we thank you so much. But we want to ask you to help us take the next step. We're a small organization. We're led mostly by volunteers. Our fearless executive director, Olivia, Doreen, a very small staff. And as powerful as they are, we need more people giving their energies full-time to this cause if we're going to move this reform forward. And so whether it's 25 bucks or better yet 25 times 4 in honor of the Civic Dollar certificates that we hope to make law, or if you have the ability to donate many times that amount, we really need your support. In the new year, the hearings will begin. If you're on our email list, as hopefully you all are, if you aren't, please sign up at the back. You'll be invited to those hearings, to events that we'll do in the communities. We will ask you, and we hope you will respond. This may not be your first issue. For me, I get to spend my daily working hours on the climate challenge, but nights and weekends often go to this cause when it's not the kids. Make this your second issue, if you can, because it affects every other issue. And because we can't possibly do it without the people in this barn and our networks magnified across the state getting engaged. So thank you so much for being here tonight. If you haven't already made a donation, many of you did to be here tonight, but if you haven't yet, please do so at the back. Better yet, do so and take something for the holidays home with you. We're going to leave the auction open for another 15 minutes, and we invite you to take another round at the back. There's some lovely items, and again, a couple of big ticket items. If anybody wants that summer holiday on Squam Lake or that winter holiday in Florida, 2 lovely places you can stay. Do it in the name of democracy, equal citizenship, and thank you for all that you've given and continue to give and will give to this cause. Thank you so much.